afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this hearing of the Budget and Finance Committee for Monday, June 23rd, 2014. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the Committee. I'm joined by my colleague, Councilmember Bob Blumenfield. We're not expecting any of the other members, I think, today, so we'll be proceeding just with the two of us. And we'll be taking, we have general public comment cards? Okay, anybody who'd like to offer general public comment, if you could please raise your hand, first of all, and then fill out one of these cards. I see none, so general public comment will be closed. We're going to take our closed session items first, so if anyone would like to offer comment on either items 1 or 2, the closed session items, please raise your hand. I see none, so public comment on those matters is now closed as well. Mr. Blumenfield, I would propose items 5 and 8, and actually, let's make it 4, 5, and 8. The DWP report, CAO report on Office of Finance and General Banking Services, and a surplus donation of vehicles to the National Guard. I would propose items 4, 5, and 8 as consent candidates.
I had a couple of questions on item 5.
Okay, that's fine. So we'll hold that then, and just if you don't have anything on the DWP report, we'll take 4 and 8 as approved on consent. And then that brings us to our consent items. So we'll start with, our closed session items. So we'll begin with item number 1.
A lot of questions.
All right, we're back in open session now. We don't need to report out any matter, I think so. Let's proceed next to item number 3.
Item 3 is a Housing and Community Investment Department report in response to motion of Farrell Blumenfield relative to the use of the city-owned property located at 1345 El Centro Avenue, Los Angeles, California 90028 by the Child Help, Inc. On May 27, 2014, the Innovation, Technology, and General Services Committee recommended various actions, and on June 11, 2014, the Housing Committee recommended to approve the motion recommendations.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Manny Chavez with the Housing and Community Investment Department. I believe the motion actually pretty much speaks for itself, but just a little historical perspective. Back in the late 80s, the former Community Development Department executed a lease with Child Help Incorporated for a facility that's located in Hollywood. It's an approximately 8,000 square foot building. In lieu of rent, the organization was to provide social services specifically targeted at child abuse victims. The lease also stipulated that after a period of 20 years, that City Council should consider conveying the property to the nonprofit, provided that the nonprofit met the terms and conditions that were articulated in the lease agreement. So we actually, in HCID, inherited this lease from the former CDD, and we have been monitoring the contractor, ensuring that they continue to provide the services that they were contracted to perform. Additionally, they've done an exceptional job with their own funds of maintaining what is in fact a city facility. So what is proposed now is that the facility actually be conveyed to Child Help. The item has actually been referred to General Services by the other 2 committees so that it can be determined surplus property, and then with the transfer of property moving forward.
I'm still a little unclear on this. The ITGS recommendations included initiating a Class A appraisal and going through the ordinary surplus property processes. Is that part of the recommendation?
That is correct.
Okay, and so once an appraisal is completed, then is it the intention that this organization is going to pay the appraised value or a negotiated price after that appraisal is done, or?
No, the intent and under the terms of the original lease were to actually simply to convey the property over to the nonprofit where they would not pay a single cent for the actual property itself.
Okay, well, what's the point of doing an appraisal if we're going to give the property away for free?
I would have to defer to General Services to respond. That's simply the process that they do follow.
Okay, and through the ordinary surplus property process, that would have to be also, the property would also have to be the opportunity to make a proposal on the property would be made available to all other government agencies in the school district and the private sector before this transaction were to be completed, right?
My understanding is that is the typical process, yes.
Well, okay, but is the recommendation here to have the typical, to
The
engage in
recommendation
the
actually
typical
does differ from that in that it's actually requesting that the property be turned over to the nonprofit at no cost. In terms of the steps, whether General Services would proceed with the determination of surplus property, again, I'd have to defer to them.
Okay. Is General Services here? Okay. Hi.
Hi, my name is Marie Rumsey. I'm here from Council Member O'Farrell's office, and I'm just kind of looking at the surplus property flow chart from General Services. There is a provision where you do the surplus property sale, and then you also do an additional ordinance for direct sale. And so I think the goal would be to do the surplus property as well as the ordinance for direct sale to child help. And then what we would do is we would ultimately bring back the conveyance document along with the appraisal, and then something that shows the valuation of services from child help in order to make the agreement equal the amount of services.
Okay.
And I imagine the city would also probably want to put a covenant on the building to ensure that child help wouldn't sell it later for a new commercial use to happen, so we can ensure that those services are continued there.
Right, and there would need to be presumably some kind of contingency in that, because if this organization ceases functioning or something, there needs to be some fallback plan.
We would need some provision where perhaps it comes back to the city.
Okay.
So all those agreements will come before this committee. This is just the first step in getting all of that in action and getting the surplus property process started.
Okay, so whenever the appraisal comes back, there will also be some valuation both of presumably prior capital investments and upkeep costs and so on that the organization has invested in the property, as well as the valuation of the social services that are being provided that are of benefit to the city.
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Mr. Blumenfield?
That's the key. We heard this in ITGF, but that's the key, is that the organization has provided these great services for these years, and we're giving them credit for that to transfer the property as per the original agreement. When you do the contingency stuff, though, I also want to make sure that we also figure out a way to release the city from liability associated with the site, which is a little bit of there's a little bit of tension in between the two issues, which is we don't want to have liability on the site, but we want to have a contingency plan. I don't know how that gets worked out, but I'm sure it can get worked out, because we certainly want to honor this agreement and forward the organization that's done great work. But I guess the devil's in the detail on seeing how those two potentially contradictory issues get resolved. But that's something I would ask that we look for, the release of future liability as well as the contingency that the chair spoke about, even though there may be a tension between those two issues.
Yeah. And just in terms of the prior lease agreement, which is now expired, right? Prior lease expired there.
It's expired, but the lease does allow it to be renewed on a month-to-month basis, absent the formal lease, which we have done.
Okay. There's only I haven't obviously looked at the lease. There's just a brief snippet of it in the report, but it does indicate that the council shall consider a conveyance. It doesn't create an obligation, as I read it, that the council do this conveyance. So I don't know that there could have been a reasonable expectation of this, but I think it's in keeping faith with the prior council's thoughts on the item that we should be consistent with that if in fact it turns out that the services and the investments and so on are somewhat consistent, at least with the valuation of the property. So, okay, so we can go ahead and I concur in the recommendations of ITGS for purposes of moving it forward to council.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that brings us to item number 5.
Item 5 is the City Administrative Officer Report relative to authority for the Director of Finance to amend contracts C-114564 and C-114826 with Wells Fargo Bank for general banking services.
Good afternoon, Jennifer
afternoon.
Lopez. Jennifer Lopez with the Office of the CAO. Before you are the amendments to extend the city's general banking services contracts with Wells Fargo Bank for 1 year. The term will go through June 30, 2015. There are no change to the terms, the conditions, or the rates of the contract. The original contracts were 5 years with 5 one-year options to renew, and this is the second 1-year extension, and there are 3 one-year extensions remaining, and the CAO recommends approval. Do you have any questions?
Okay, Mr. Blumenfield?
So a couple questions, and part of them are in light of the discussion we had in budget earlier about bank fees and bank rates and making sure that the city is getting the best rate on all of its services. So how are we sure that we're going to continue to receive the most competitive rates, especially considering that this contract no longer has the competition in the contract as previous ones did? with the Wells Fargo and Wachovia?
I would have to defer to the Office of Finance on that one.
Good afternoon, Saul Romo with the Office of Finance, and with me is Ms. Clarissa Mullins, who is the Director of Cash Management, who has a lot of the technical expertise on the banking services. In terms of the competitiveness for the bank rates, I can tell you that Wells Fargo provides, we receive merchant fee services through these Wells Fargo contracts, through Wells Fargo itself and through Elevon. Both of these organizations process credit card transactions for us. We are going to be meeting with Wells Fargo this week to specifically review in response to inquiries received during the budget process from the committee and from the council as to trying to maintain competitive and good merchant fee rates. In terms of the obtaining bank fee rates, these rates at the time that the RFP was proposed were among the more competitive rates that were established. If we were to try and renegotiate the rates, it would obviously trigger a renegotiation of the agreement and would potentially trigger a new RFP process. We constantly monitor the bank fees and the transactions within departments, and I think what we've started to put a focus on is to taking a look at our bank fees analysis on a monthly basis to take a look at the trends that we're identifying among departments to see where we could identify some cost savings. There may be some small wiggle room in achieving better rates, or if we are already achieving better rates, the option then is to look to see our departments optimizing and using the best bank services for their dollar. So I'll give you an example. I know there's been a lot of focus placed on the costs for processing credit cards and transaction fees. Credit cards are a little bit more cost effective than processing checks, than processing cash, because with that comes obviously the potential for loss from either theft or negligence, for fraud through credit card, through check fraud. So we evaluate to see what's the best banking service for a departmental operation and to see if they're getting the best bang for the buck.
If I could add as well, just want to clarify that the pure bank fees, which really pertain to the commercial banking services, are actually running at around $2 million. The rest are the credit card services for throughout the city. And so bank fees have remained relatively flat, and we do scrutinize them very closely. The merchant card services are a pass-through, and so they go through Wells Fargo. But really, the pure bank fees from depository activities, lockbox, desktop deposits, flat and very, very competitively priced.
But we're locking in for another year whatever fee structure is in place.
Correct.
Yes.
If we were to issue an RFP, we would be able to renegotiate those.
Correct.
And you're saying that you've done what I'm hearing you say, and I don't want to mischaracterize it. You've done the analysis, and you don't think that we would be able to save that much money, so it's not worth doing another RFP this year.
It wouldn't be worth it to do another RFP this year in terms of obtaining a little bit more competitive rates. We are having an internal discussion about the next process, assuming we continue to exercise the remaining options to extend this agreement. We are having an internal discussion about what's the next process from there. Do we continue a relationship with this bank? Do we renegotiate the terms? Do we go back to an RFP? Because one of these agreements used to be a legacy Wachovia agreement. Wachovia was absorbed by Wells Fargo, which is why we now have two separate agreements with Wells Fargo, one under the conditions that were absorbed through the old Wachovia agreement. It took us over a year to migrate the account structure from Wachovia to Wells Fargo with a very intensive and exhaustive demand on our staff time, both on behalf of the bank and on behalf of the city, especially during an austere financial time when we were losing positions. So with the prospect that if we were to transition to another bank as well to obtain better rates, notwithstanding the better rates and the cost savings from obtaining a better bank fee structure, there is also an implicit logistical process that we'd have to undertake, which is not an easy process. It can easily be a year to two transition time.
And there's a cost there. I mean, so obviously the whole thing is a
Correct.
cost-benefit analysis, and you're saying that the transition costs are so much bigger than the savings that we might get, that it's not even worth spelling out the equation.
Well, it could be, but I think at this point, it wouldn't be prudent to look at looking at a better bank fee structure with such a short period of time remaining under these existing contracts. I think our recommendation would be that we continue the operation for Wells Fargo for another year. We ponder coming back to the committee and to the council to exercise the remaining options on this contract, and knowing that at least we have for the remaining 3 or 4 years through 2018 an existing bank relationship, when we know what the fee structures are, we can then ponder, do we continue the relationship under a renewed bank fee structure, go to an RFP to try and let the competitive process bring more competitive bank fees to us, or continue the relationship as is.
But this is the same thing that happened, like this time last year, someone had this, I wasn't here, but this exact conversation, right? You were going to extend it for another year, and if they asked the same questions I asked, they would have been told the same answers, and then it'll happen again next year.
I don't expect that we'll be having these conversations too much longer, because I think as we're getting to the finality of these agreements and we're now pondering where to move forward, and as we're looking closely at the banking operations, I think the questions that we have been asked last year and that we're now raising now, if raised again, we will have decisive answers and I think more clear answers for you.
One other item worth pointing out is that it will also create a lot of adjustments in how all of the point-of-sale terminals in the credit card setups are linked to all of these sub-accounts. It will ripple throughout the city and at multiple levels. And so it's a very complex process that is time-consuming, but we're constantly looking at all of not only at the infrastructure and the demand on staff time, but we are negotiating as well where we can for improvement in other services that are in place. But it is something we're looking at.
And when we look at this in the RFP, do we also consider other factors like predatory lending and issues like that in terms of?
Yes, as a matter of fact, they are required to comply with the responsible banking ordinance and all of the other reporting. But the bulk of the services of Wells Fargo is more commercial on the depository side. This does not cover the lending side of what the other departments are doing.
And their report under the responsible banking ordinance is now posted online. So they fulfill their obligations in their reporting requirements.
I guess certainly, I don't see anything other than moving forward on the 1-year extension, but I don't want to be in this position, next year. I'd love and I understand, I have full faith and confidence in the work that you're doing. I would like to have some mechanism where we can better understand the cost-benefit analysis that you're doing, that some of that information can come to this committee so we can look at it. And maybe it's part of this broader discussion we're going to have on bank fees and on fees. But I do think it's an important discussion to have. So it's with some resistance that that we approve these, as they come up, because I do think we need to look at the overall structure. But that being said, I don't want to stop us from approving something in the interim. I just want to make sure that information is coming forward so that when you tell me we've done the cost-benefit analysis, we can feel good as the policymakers saying we have it in front of us. We understand why it does make sense.
Well, since it sounds like that discussion is already underway internally.
Correct.
I think it is certainly helpful for us to hear earlier rather than later whether or not an RFP is advisable. I mean, that seems to always be true whenever we're renewing any contract. And so would it be appropriate then, I think it would be helpful for us to have a report back from you with your recommendations in, say, 3 months. So we'll go ahead and move forward on this renewal, but then let's have a check-in in 3 months or 4 months if you need it, to hear your recommendations about, your analysis of competing bank rates in the marketplace and whether or not there might be an appropriate cost savings opportunity if we did go out for an RFP. Or some other recommendation for renegotiation, but whatever your recommendations are for cost savings in the coming year, following this extension year, it would be helpful for us to have that in the first half of this next fiscal year rather than the second half.
We will do so. We'll report back within 3 to 4 months.
Very good.
And maybe also as part of that, to quantify the juggernaut in terms of you're saying that there's a huge cost to considering any sort of change.
Correct.
And that the savings are of a certain scale and that the logistical change is something else. And so I want to understand both the savings side of it and also that juggernaut.
Right.
That we just can't get past, or we're going to have to, because eventually we can only get 5 years out of this. But that'll also help us, because eventually we're going to have to pay that price.
That's true. It's a question either we're addressing now or, within 3 years as we move further, and we certainly don't want to wait till we get to that point because...
And we lose a lot of leverage, too.
Yes, we do.
So that, to make that part of the report back. Okay, great.
Great. So we'll go ahead and approve the recommendation as amended with the instruction for a report back on the issues to be discussed.
Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to item number 6.
Item number 6 is a motion, Martinez-Price, relative to street improvements and permit fee requirements for the construction of the Los Angeles County Flood Control District, Rory M. Shaw Wetlands Park, and the Sun Valley Watershed Upper Storm Drain System Project. On June 18, 2014, the Public Works and Gang Reduction Committee approved the motion recommendations.
Hi.
Hi, good afternoon.
Arcelia Arce from Councilwoman Martinez's office. So this is a 46-acre joint project with the LA County Flood Control District and the city. They're converting a gravel pit into a multi-purpose facility that will alleviate the flooding in the area, provide water quality improvements, and open space. Because it's a mutual benefit, the county's investing $162 million, and city has invested $17.8 in Prop O and $1 million and change in Prop K. The county intends to hand it over to us once they're done constructing it for us to operate. So they have asked us if we could take on the street improvements. I believe it was agreed upon in the previous administration, so our office is just kind of carrying it forward. The storm drain work that's triggering the street improvements won't begin until 2017. The county intends to pull permits to begin construction for the park and the wetlands portion either in August or the fall. So this action will just allow the county to pull their permits.
Okay. Yeah, Mr. Blumenfield.
Do we have an ongoing maintenance plan with the county, or is the city going to take on all the maintenance costs?
The city's going to take on the maintenance costs.
And do we have any cost estimate?
Do you know if there's cost estimates for maintenance?
Maintenance cost, good afternoon, Kendra Kokuda, Propositional Program, Bureau of Engineering. In general, these wetland-type projects, the maintenance cost has been averaging 3 to 7% of the construction cost. The construction cost of this project being the stormwater part of it, $82 million. But that's a sort of a ballpark figure for you.
You're saying 3% of $82 million would be the ongoing maintenance cost?
3 to 7%, something like that. That's correct. Depending on this.
Not insubstantial.
Yeah, it's a major stormwater detention and capture and reuse
Great project.
Infiltration system. So there are certain needs of maintenance needs.
Yeah, it sounds like a great project. We don't have a lot to go on here with what we have in front of us. If, for example, the county transfers the jurisdiction over to the city, first of all, has the city attorney opined on this and whether it works, whether this legally works to do this, to have this kind of exchange, and also what does that do to liability that might arise in the future, potentially because of defects in what the county's done and so forth? Is that going to be addressed?
So the Bureau of Sanitation is the lead negotiator for the city to work on a memorandum of understanding with LA County on implementing this project. I believe they're in a draft form right now. I don't know if that agreement addresses those issues, council member, but we can check and get back to you on that.
We'll definitely make sure that it includes that.
Okay, so if the MOU is still in the works, what's the step that we're taking now, and how is it conditioned on completion of the MOU?
So they need to pull permits. Yes. So this step is to allow them to pull their permits.
Correct.
They've completed design.
The action you're taking here will allow them to start pulling their permits for the project itself. The MOU also will have other conditions, such as we have to transfer our $17.8 million to the county also, which hasn't occurred yet. So there's going to be several contingencies or conditions that would need to be satisfied before the MOU is resolved. Once again, I don't have the details regarding the warranties, if you will, or the condition of the transfer of the project to the city, but I will talk to my colleagues at the Bureau of Sanitation and make them aware of these concerns, your concerns, sir.
Okay. So really what you're looking for is essentially a fee waiver for the permits at this point?
Not a fee waiver.
It's actually,
I keep getting told.
It's not a fee waiver, it's a street improvement waiver. So Strathern, Tahunga, and Fair Avenue have street improvements that this motion would defer to the city as a later capital project and allow the county to move forward with their project without having to complete the improvements at this time.
Okay.
So they could begin the project, that's the wetlands in the park, without having to start on the street right now.
With the expectation that once we assume that responsibility, the street improvements would be our responsibility, so there wouldn't be a fee?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Bloomfield? Okay, thank you. Thanks for that explanation. It'll be the
Thank you.
action of the committee then or of Chair and Mr. Blumenfield to recommend approval.
Do you want to proceed to item 7?
Yes, please.
Item 7 is a city attorney report and ordinance relative to amending the Los Angeles Administrative Code to establish a service purchase program for certain members of the Los Angeles Fire Police Pension Plan, to add Tier 6 members to the Deferred Retirement Option Plan, DROP, and to make other technical changes.
Mary Jo Kerwin, Deputy City Attorney.
Joe Salazar, Assistant General Manager with Fire and Police Pensions.
Go right ahead.
Did you have any questions? Did you want me to review basically what this
Yeah.
involves?
Yes, if you could.
Okay. Well, we've put a couple things in here. The primary motivation for this is the charter amendment that was adopted last year after certain members of the General Services Office of OPS Services went over to the LAPD, and they remained in Lacers, but there was a provision that allowed them to have the option of trying out for regular police positions. And if they would then have a choice of whether to remain in Lacers or to transfer over to the Fire and Police Pension System. They, of course, were concerned because they were leaving all their time behind in Lacers, so you have to have 20 years with Fire and Police to vest in Tier 6. So as a result of their concern, after this transfer was approved, the charterman was put on that authorized the City Council to allow them to buy their sworn service that they had with the General Services Department with Fire and Police Pension Services, provided it was cost neutral to the city. So this ordinance has been examined by the actuaries for both plans, because the game plan basically is that the city will value the contributions that are in the Lacers plan that's attributable to sworn service. Those will be, if they want to buy the time with Fire and Police, those contributions will be transferred to fire and police. The time that they're buying will be valued by the actuary at the cost for fire and police pension plan, and any difference will have to be paid by the member. So that's basically what the primary motivation. As a secondary thing that was added on, the CAO requested that Tier 6, the drop plan for fire and police pension plan does not include any provisions that directly apply to Tier 6. And so apparently the understanding was that Tier 6 members would have the right to be in drop also. So they asked us to add those in. And then there is a couple little technical amendments we've included too.
Okay, and was that drop eligibility issue included in Charter Amendment B? Was that anticipated?
No, the city, there's an existing charter amendment that gives the city council the authority to do the drop, to adopt a drop program for members of the plan. So they would simply go in to the existing program on this, basically the same terms that the other tiers go in.
Okay. Go ahead.
A drop is supposed to be a cost-neutral program, and that is to be reviewed annually. The actuary has, there will be an actuarial report. I think it was just received this afternoon, and it will be filed prior to council hearing this matter on Wednesday. And most of the programs are considered to be cost-neutral programs.
How many former GSD employees are eligible, do you think, or will take advantage of the option to buy into the system?
Well, there's about 39 that we have information on that may actually do a 1014 transfer to fire and police pensions, but the first group, there's less than 20 that'll do the initial transfer opportunity into regular sworn LAPD classifications. But as far as how many will opt to do a purchase.
What is that, like, percentage-wise ballpark number in terms of employees doing it?
Total, as far as the OPS officers that were merged with LAPD?
Yeah.
That would be about half. You know, for this first group, you know, there may be more in the future, but you know, they have to go through an abbreviated academy in order to have the opportunity to transfer to LAPD classifications.
But all the ones who are transferring, of those, they're taking advantage of switching into the system? There's no reason not to, I guess.
I think that he's asking how, I don't know about the total number of OPS officers that there were that went over. Is that what you're asking?
I was just trying to get a sense of how many people are actually doing this, you know, taking advantage of the option to buy into the system, and is that most of them, all of them, you know?
Well,
and that just gives you a sense of how the program's working.
At this stage, we had the first counseling session with the first batch that will be 1014, so it's probably too soon to tell really. And since the purchases have to be cost neutral, it's has considerable price tag associated with buying the OPS service.
I mean, considerable price tag. The person has to come up front because they also have to base their salary on their new salary of where they're at in terms of buying back the time. Is that the idea?
Depends on how many years of service they have as an OPS officer, the entry age into the plan. So there's a variety of factors. So the cost, you know, can be in the hundreds of thousands, and the employee is going to have to pay for all of that. Either, you know, they can use deferred comp money or transfer from another eligible retirement plan, and they can finance it over their remaining career. So that's a couple of options.
Can they do like a reciprocity kind of thing?
So there isn't reciprocity because it's really
The same thing.
It's just, you know, here's the price tag. They can transfer funds from Lacers, and then they can come up with money out of pocket also to pay.
What it amounts to is that the money is going to come from Lacers, will be all of their contributions for this service, and then the portion of what the funds that the city has paid into Lacers for this period of time. Lacers is not 100% funded, so they won't get 100% value of what the city would normally owe for that service. I don't know whether it's in the 80% range that they're funded, but they will have to calculate if they had this, let's say they had 5 years that they can transfer over. they would say in Lacers, this value is, I guess, $100,000. And if they buy it with fire and police, the cost, the plan for that 5 years might be $200,000. They would get the $100,000 credit from Lacers would be transferred over, $100,000 difference they would have to pay. I'm just pulling those numbers out of a hat, but but just to give you an idea. So they would get the credit for what is already in the Lacer systems that would go over. They would have to pay the difference.
I just had a little bit more specific information. 14 people are being 1014 right now, and then there's another in the queue, another 14 people that are possibly going to be transferring. So that's kind of your universe that could potentially move over into police and fire pension at this point. So 20 to 30 people probably will ultimately take advantage of the transfer, and then from that, like they were saying, depending on the cost of buying that time, they'll make an individual decision whether they want to stay in Lacers.
And it's unfortunate that we aren't able to have this ordinance finalized before they have to make their decision, but we're trying to get it to council so at least they can have the first reading in council beforehand. It just took a lot of discussions with the actuary. We had to get tax council involved. There's been a lot of study gone into this ordinance, so I'm pretty comfortable that it's a well-drafted ordinance.
Okay. Any further? Okay. Thank you. We'll go ahead and advance the recommendations to council. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have any additional cards? All right. That brings us to the end of our agenda, and we are adjourned.